There's a phrase that's decently popular that many of you have probably heard in the past, and it goes something like this. Anytime somebody wants to tell you something, but then they have to put a comma but in there, everything before the comma doesn't matter. This actually makes a ridiculous amount of sense. I mean, what if somebody says, you know what, I really trust you. But then what if they say, I really trust you, but. What if they say, I love you versus I love you, but. It hits a lot differently, and it really does seem to compromise everything that came before that comma. Compromise is the operative word here, because that's exactly what you see a lot of people do with their faith. A lot of people like the idea of Christ. They might like the person of Christ. They may like the traditions and the culture and the different things that we learn from what Christ said. But they have different conditions that they want to place on their willingness to actually serve or to learn, to grow, whatever it may be that we need to grow as followers of Christ. Well, one of the areas where this is probably the most pronounced is in another story that many of you have probably read many times. It's where you have individuals coming up to Christ trying to speak with him as he is actually departing a region. You see, he's basically called his disciples to go to an area away from where many of these crowds are, but then you have some individuals step out of the crowd and say, but I want to follow you. I want to follow you. You're going to see how these individuals approach Christ, there's always a comma but. And even though they didn't insert it into the sentence, Christ, who knew their hearts, was able to insert it for them and highlight where they were more than willing to compromise on their faith, no matter how devout they felt they were being. Anytime we talk about compromised faith, you have to talk about Saul. And when I talk about Saul, I'm not talking about Saul who would later become Paul in the New Testament. I'm talking about King Saul. Now, you have to keep in mind, context is king, that King Saul only came about because you had the people of Israel who had these judges. There's an entire book of the Bible about it. It's called Judges. Good read. Well, what you end up seeing in this book of the Bible called Judges is that God basically was telling his people, you don't need a worldly king because I am your king. You have these judges who will help you to interpret and apply my law, but you don't need a king. I am your king. Well, the people of Israel looked at all the kingdoms around them and said, but they have kings. I want a king. If they have a king, why can't I have a king? I want somebody who's going to be tall and brave and sit on the top of a horse as we ride into battle. And so God said, fine. And in kind of a funny way, literally sent one of his prophets over to say, look, there's a guy on his horse. That's going to be our king. And that's how you got King Saul. I'm joking, but not by that much. So what you see in the life of King Saul is that he was an individual who in many ways seems surprisingly human. I think he oftentimes gets a bad rap because people see him as kind of this, fundamentally flawed individual before you got King David that we all kind of look up to and revere. King Saul looks so much like us, and that's something that you guys are going to see here in a second. You're going to look at one of the stories that happens basically right before God communicates through his prophet Samuel that Saul, you no longer have my favor. I'm kind of walking away from you at this point in time. And as you go through this, what I want you to do is look at how God gave Saul very clear instruction, how Saul made a compromise that maybe to him seemed very reasonable. He even seemed to believe his own lie that his compromise was reasonable. But at the end of the day, compromise was not sufficient for what God had called Saul to do. Now, I don't know how your conversation went and how you guys read that story, but I know sometimes that can be a little off-putting to modern-day individuals who are reading. I mean, you look at something that says, kill every man, woman, and child, and leave no livestock of this people that they wouldn't be remembered. Well, you look at that, it sounds very, very, very harsh, and understandably so. Now, you have to remember, these people were, for all intents and purposes, these people were basically genocidally trying to eliminate the Hebrew people. So that was a little bit of tit for tat in there, but still, it comes across as being something very harsh. We could go into the cultural and historical study of, how that all plays out and kind of how their norms were different than our norms. But putting that on the side burner, just focus on the fact that God was very clear with Saul. Go do this thing. And he didn't leave any room for interpretation, but yet Saul made this very human exception that, well, I got to feed my people. I got to make certain that we can, pay for the campaign and all that. But yet God said that's insufficient. And I think what you end up taking away from this is that Saul was willing to be conformed by his worldly knowledge and wisdom. And because he was being conformed by the worldly things, he couldn't truly be used by the heavenly things. This is one of the things that you guys are going to read here in a second in Colossians, is that we are called to not be conformed by the things of this world. And if we were to be honest with ourselves and think about all of the different things that will cause us to compromise our calling, our conviction, our sincerity, and our service in Christ, they are probably all things that are inherently born of this world. Compromise is something we talk about as a virtue, and it is in a human context. I mean, when you have individuals who can compromise within a family unit, you can reach these levels of harmony and agreement that, otherwise you really can't get to unless you just have an abusive relationship. Compromise in government, something we never see anymore, is something that can lead to people living harmoniously with one another. But compromise when it comes to ultimate truth is something that can't be seen as okay. I mean, if you compromise the truth even a little bit to make it more palatable, it ceases to be the truth. This is why God calls us to truth. He calls us to an uncompromising life, a life that is willing to hold up God as number one, unprofaned and unblemished by the things of this world, and then put everything else over on the other hand. Now, we as individuals struggle with these two sides that simply don't mix. They're like oil and water. But yet this is kind of the lives that we are called to live. These lives where we're still here in this world and we still have to struggle with the things of this world. But at the same time, we have to understand what truly reigns supreme. There's a lot of different places that we could go into and study just kind of based on that thought alone. But we can leave with this and this alone for just today. God calls us to something higher, to something greater, to something more glorious than the things of this world. So why would we ever want something cheaper? Why would we ever want to be conformed by this world? So I encourage you all to live a life that strives to be uncompromised. Live a life that truly reflects Christ, not based on the convenience and not based on the conditions that the world wants to place on us, but instead based on the convictions that God places on your heart. That's our lesson that we have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. And until we can meet again, God bless.